A young Marine named Eugene Sledge peered over a busted stone wall near Dakeshi and saw a line of Japanese troops jogging through smoke as if they owned the road. Then the sky changed. A rushing sound made every head duck, even the veterans. Black, sausage-shaped puffs popped over the column, 155mm airbursts cracking with a flash and a hard carump. The ridgeline rippled. Bodies fell and vanished in dust. The artillerymen were zeroed in. Sledge and his buddies stood in silence and watched the barrage take its toll. He remembered their gait, bow-legged, proud, not panicked. The enemy wasn't shattered yet, only stunned. But 10 minutes of American fire had turned a confident retreat into a running cut. The road became a counting board. Every shell drew a new mark. This wasn't an accident. K divided by 3 divided by 5 of the 1st Marine Division was pushing toward Shuri in May 1945, and the men had learned to trust a simple miracle. If a forward Marine could see a target, American guns could find it fast. It sounded like a storm. It moved like math. Infantry watched steel land exactly where it was asked, then watched it land again a little to the left, a little short, a little long, until the zone of survival shrank to nothing. It felt impossible that someone miles away could shift so precisely in seconds. But that was the American trick standard calls, reliable radios, trained fire direction centers, and batteries that answered like they were one giant weapon. The shells stitched the earth. The Japanese tried to fall back on order, then disappeared into the smoke. An enlisted Marine like Sledge saw the effects before he learned the words air burst, timed fuse, massed fires. He saw the Japanese rise from cover. Then he saw them drop under a new quilt of exploding air. He saw what American industry meant when the pile of empty brass beside a gun trail didn't slow the rate of fire at all. The line advanced as if an unseen bulldozer was punching holes in the world. It was not luck. It was a system. The system worked in minutes. The system worked all day. That was the breathtaking part. There was still the hard truth of the ground. The platoon stepped off. The village ahead was smashed flat, its tiled roofs now ash and splinters. Every stone wall hid splinters. Every shallow gully hid a machine gun mouth. But they moved because the barrage gave orders the way a sergeant did. Clear, loud, final. Move now. Move here. The men learned to hear the difference between outgoing and incoming. They learned to trust the swish overhead as the sound of safety for the next 5 seconds. When the barrage lifted exactly 100 yards, they moved exactly 100 yards. If you could count, you could live. A private who had never seen a fire plan on paper still understood the choreography. He saw what a nation could do when it trained its teenagers to speak in maps. He saw the miracle of batteries he could not see, crews he would never meet, loading shells he would never touch for a ridgeline he could smell. He also saw the price. The counter shells came back hard. A corpsman fell. Dust filled mouths. Men crawled in mud that had more metal than water in it. Courage wasn't a word. Courage was staying put while your own artillery scissored 50 yards away, trusting that the next cut would spare you and kill them. The enemy's reaction emphasized the revelation. Those troops running in the open weren't fools. They were disciplined. They had been ordered to give ground and draw the fight into stronger positions. They didn't flinch under noise alone. They had held on Peleliu. They had beaten other attacks. But they had not seen this pace of precision before. They had not seen rounds climb a hillside like a ladder. They had not seen air itself become lethal to men hugging rocks. That is why the scene Sledge recorded feels like a lever moving history. It shows the moment when the old calculus courage plus caves equals survival met a new variable, American coordination at scale. A single minute of such fire is terrifying. 10 is world-changing. Multiply that by a day and you get doctrine. Preparation fires that weren't just warnings, they were erasers. Multiply that by a week and you get inevitability. Ammunition dumps far behind the line kept trucks moving forward. Gunners trimmed fuses and checked charges by the book. Observers corrected fire as smoothly as breathing. The division commander didn't need poetry. He needed a promise that when the infantry reached a wall of rock, the wall would not exist much longer. American artillery made that promise. And yet the story stayed human. A private felt the ground shudder in his boots and tasted grit in his teeth. He heard the rattle of Marine machine guns on the flanks and knew other kids, no older than him, were tying each Japanese attempt to run into a knot of crossing fire. He looked down at his hands and saw them shaking. He looked up and saw the barrage lift. He ran. He did not run because he was fearless. He ran because someone behind him, someone he'd never see, had carved a path with thunder. The enemy learned a different lesson. Caves that once sheltered now became traps. The rule "wait out the barrage" no longer worked because the attack arrived before the ears stopped ringing. Survivors moved and were spotted, and the next correction arrived before officers could issue fresh orders. That is why the illusion broke here. The illusion was simple, that a determined defender could outlast anything. In this place, in these minutes, they saw that America didn't run out. Not of shells, not of will, not of precision. If a ridge could vanish in 10 minutes, what could 10 hours do? What could 10 days do? The road to Shuri lay ahead. There were more ridges, there were more stone villages and more walls. But the men in K, divided by 3, divided by 5, had seen an impossible thing become standard. They had watched a ridgeline go quiet before their watches made a full circle. And, once you see that, you know what you're part of. You are part of a vast machine with a beating heart, a republic that can make math feel like mercy to you and like doom to the enemy. You still have to cross the open. You still have to crawl the last yard. But you are not alone. Behind you is a country that can move mountains with a radio and a map, and will keep doing it until the last cave goes dark. A 19-year-old scout scratched a grid into wet dirt with a bayonet tip and pressed his handset against a helmet ear. He whispered numbers. Far away, men he would never meet heard those numbers and swung trails, cut charges, twisted fuse setters, and pulled lanyards. The first salvo landed long, throwing coral chips like hail. He breathed, corrected, and felt time bend to him. The second salvo walked back toward the line of caves. He could hear the swish overhead from batteries he could not see, like trains flying just above the world. 10 seconds after speaking, he watched stone turn into smoke. If you want to know how a free nation wins, start with that grid. It seems simple. It is not. It is the product of standardized calls for fire, gunnery tables carried in men's heads, radios that worked in rain and mud, and the iron habit of units trained to act as one. Fire direction centers took bearings, applied corrections, massed separate batteries onto a single target as if they were one gun. A corporal with a handset became a conductor. The barrage flowed to his stick-wound map like music flowing to a baton. Sledge's company saw what that meant in lives saved. When a column of Japanese infantry broke into a trot near Dakeshi, they couldn't outrun the adjustments. Too many American guns were listening to the same voice. Large black bursts stitched the air over their heads like a zipper closing. The artillerymen were zeroed in on target. The infantry on the wall didn't cheer. They counted seconds and learned the shape of survival. They watched the barrage shift in small bites that meant someone with a radio had bent the battle to a new line. They moved only when steel told them to move. They stopped when steel told them to stop. It worked the same when the roles reversed. Japanese guns stabbed back. Shells chopped walls into powder. Men hugged the earth and tasted pennies in their mouths. A corpsman named Kent Caswell took fragments to the neck. Marines clustered around him with shaking hands and stubborn gentleness, because radios cannot cauterize a wound. The FO kept his voice level under the scream of incoming and the metallic hiss of outgoing, because other Marines were still out there, pinned and counting on those corrections. The pipeline of math and steel never stopped because the infantry never stopped needing it. Now imagine being the man in the cave mouth and learning this pace for the first time. You have trained to endure barrages. You are brave. You have learned to wait. You know the American thunder will end. You plan to clamber out and fire, but the thunder doesn't end. It moves 50 yards, 100 yards, and you rise into the teeth of it. Your runners carry messages, but the corrections outrun them. Your machine gun opens and draws a fresh rectangle of shells. The lesson is hard. You can be brave and doomed at the same time when the enemy's network is faster than your legs. This acceleration had a personality. It sounded like a calm voice on a handset saying, "Drop 100, left 50, fire for effect." It looked like infantry sprinting into ground the barrage had vacuumed. It felt like a drummer keeping time for 1,000 men who couldn't even see him. The marvel is that a democracy trained teenagers to do this under fire, then trusted them to do it right. Officers wrote plans, but corporals delivered miracles in seconds. There was always the human cost humming under the precision. Sledge wrote of headaches that never left. He wrote of feeling stupefied after days of thunder. He wrote of lying in foxholes while friendly shells tore the air above and enemy shells clawed the ground around. He still lifted his head when the barrage shifted. He still ran when the correction opened the lane. That is what American superiority looked like at the human level. Not chest thumping, but a steady obligation to act because the machine had opened the door, and you were the one who had to step through it. The Japanese respected this. Their retreat through Dakeshi looked organized because it was. They could move like a machine, too. But the moment they realized the Americans could stack fires as quickly as a man could speak, something changed in their eyes. They didn't run like panicked men. They ran like soldiers crossing open ground under a sky that hated them. Later, the prisoners said it simply, "We waited in caves. You found the air." That line alone tells you why America prevailed. We did not ask courage to do the work of radios and factories. We asked courage to exploit a path our country's discipline had already cleared. This is the switchboard that won. A map case, a handset, a standard language, a battery's worth of math done in a heartbeat. The FO's gift wasn't magic. It was practice. It was the ethics of precision. Hit the ground you meant to hit. Don't hit the ground you meant to save. In that ethic lies the better part of our pride. The barrages were terrible, but they were also controlled. That control protected Americans and crushed enemies faster, ending battles sooner and saving lives in ways that are hard to count on a page but real in the dirt. By sunset, the scout's hand was bleeding where the bayonet had scraped his palm. He marked one more correction and felt the wind shift. The ridge, once a sentence of death, now looked crossable. He raised his head. He told the platoon to move. Behind him, the unseen gunners reset their sights for the night. The switchboard stayed awake. The Republic kept listening. A destroyer rode a grey swell off Okinawa, while her 5-inch mounts worked like beating hearts. The captain held her steady in rain. A spotter plane called corrections. The rounds reached far inland, then walked up a spine of coral where Marines had pointed. The sailors didn't see the cave mouths. They saw numbers, angles, and the churn of the recoil system. But they knew what it meant when the splash marched right. Somewhere ashore boys were hanging on. Somewhere ashore a corpsman was digging with bleeding hands. The ship poured thunder into a valley they could not see, and men they would never meet stood up and moved because of it. Sledge felt that orchestra from the foxhole. He wrote of massive artillery, mortar, naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, smashing one a draw and one a ridge on his flank. He remembered 30 tanks, including 4 flamethrowers, blasting the draw, then the guns and planes plastering the enemy positions all over again, until he wondered what quiet felt like. He wrote of barrages that went on and on for hours, and then days, a weight of fire that made the island tremble. He did not exaggerate. He measured with his own heartbeat. The Navy, the Army, and the Marines wrote the same music on different staves. The logic is breathtaking. Ships with radar and stable platforms could hit coordinates again and again in weather that grounded planes. Fire direction centers on land could knit naval salvos into rolling barrages. Tanks with dozer blades and flamethrowers chewed the draw, while heavy mortars laced the edges. Then planes stitched the top. Then ships stepped in again. If a position survived the first cut, American steel returned sharper. You can imagine a Japanese captain in a cave trying to set a schedule, endure a bombardment, then surge. But the schedule broke. There was always one more volley. For Marines on the floor of one drawer, the sight of 30 tanks, including 4 specialized flamethrowers, looked like a myth, walking. It smelled like gasoline and scorched limestone. A flamethrower arc rolled into a cave mouth, and air turned black. Then the guns spoke again, and the tanks backed up, and the planes bit the ridgeline, and the valley became a throat, choking on smoke. Men advanced under that cover, and felt what it meant to be a citizen of a country that could coordinate this orchestra. It wasn't mere violence. It was the craft of ending strongpoints that had stood for months. On VE Day the men still crouched in mud, and the thunder did not pause for celebration. That detail matters because it shows the American character in the Pacific, steady, relentless, focused on the living fight. The sailors who fed powder bags into breaches did not stand on a parade deck. They stood in wet boots. The officers plotting a new mission didn't give speeches. They gave corrections. Inside that discipline lay a kind of love, the kind that keeps shooting when your own men are one ridge away and trust you to be exact. The enemy learned the lesson in pain. Caves were supposed to be time machines. You go inside, and time pauses. The blast passes. You emerge into the same battle you left. But with naval guns in the mix, the caves were no longer safe clocks. The entrances collapsed, vents clogged, comms wires snapped. The line between waiting and suffocating blurred. Japanese counterattacks arrived late because someone had to dig out and someone had to find a runner, and before the runner reached battalion, new strikes hit. That is how the end comes in a fortress fight, not with a single blow, but with a tempo the defender cannot match. Sledge didn't romanticize any of this. He wrote about the pounding giving him a continuous headache. He wrote about stupefaction, a dullness that made thinking slow. He also wrote about getting up anyway when the order came, because the barrage had bought a window you couldn't waste. He ran across open ground with tracers like long white streaks around his head, and believed he might make it because someone offshore was still listening to a spotter. That belief is an arm of American power. It's not loud, it's quiet and exact. I will do my job because my countrymen are doing theirs. The statistics sit behind the scenes like steel foundations. 30 tanks committed to a single draw, 4 of them literal fire breathers. Guns that speak for hours, then for days. It takes factories to support that. It takes shipyards and railroads and plants casting barrels by the hundreds. It takes ammunition lines that don't blink when asked for another 1,000 rounds before nightfall. It takes a nation that believes in standard bolts and standard call signs more than it believes in slogans. That is how 5-inch naval gunfire lands exactly where a corporal ashore needs it to land, for as long as it must. The sailors had their own small miracles. A mount crew that could clear a jammed case in seconds. A director officer who could call a new deflection while a wave passed under the bow. A crew that could reload when the deck pitched and the world tilted. They weren't marble heroes. They were craftsmen. Their craft saved boys they never saw. That is a kind of romance we don't tell often enough. Men in blue dungarees making thunder sing on time. By day's end, the valley still looked like hell, but fewer Japanese rifles cracked from the forward slopes. The caves were not empty yet. They were, however, quieter. The infantry used those breaths like gold. They pushed a squad to the next fold. They established a new base of fire. They dragged a casualty to a corpsman who had waited, listening to the same thunder, ready with a morphine syringe and the kindest hands in the world. The ships kept station. The gunners kept cutting into stone. The miracle continued. Later, prisoners used plain words. We waited in caves. You found the air. That line belongs on a memorial because it names the combination that won. American precision, American persistence, and American mercy for our own. The destroyer's guns cooled. The Marines updated grids for tomorrow. The country slept far away, not knowing every round fired had drawn a line between life and death on a map no one at home would ever see. That is fine. The men who lived didn't need applause. They needed steel on target, and they got it, until fortress after fortress failed. A Sherman belched a river of fire into a black cave mouth, and the valley gasped like a living thing. The flame rolled, bright as a foundry door, then sucked back with a roar that rattled helmets. The tank commander's voice was flat, again. The gunner hosed the entrance, and the limestone skin blistered. On Wanna Ridge and down into Wanna Draw, 30 tanks, 4 of them flamethrowers, did the impossible job. Sailors and gunners had set up all morning. The valley's echoes became steady work. The Marines in K, divided by 3, divided by 5, rose from their holes, counted to 5, and moved because someone had burned the worst fear out of the dark. A total of 30 tanks, including 4 flamethrowers, blasted and burned Wanna Draw. Our artillery, heavy mortars, ship's guns, and planes then plastered the enemy positions all over again. The shock was not the fire by itself, it was the cycle. Flame hit first, and the caves coughed out smoke and men. Mortars stitched the edges. Artillery swished overhead in long strings. Aircraft shouldered the top of the ridge. Then everything started again. Sledge felt the repetition as pain. The thunderous American barrages went on and on for hours, and then days. The math of persistence broke men long before metal did, and when the barrage paused, the tanks were already in low gear, pushing rubble aside so riflemen could pass. That's how the United States solved granite and willpower, by making violence precise, repeatable, and kind to its own. On the floor of the draw, a corporal with a Thompson took 3 steps and heard machine gun fire snap, past, tracers like long white streaks. He didn't zigzag. He ran straight because the FO said the next cut would fall 100 yards ahead, not 100 yards behind. He splashed a thin stream and felt mud cling to his boots. Above, Japanese guns rattled, professional and cold. Below, American shells erased the angle they were firing from. Bullets zipped and snapped around my head, the tracers like long white streaks. We must have run about 300 yards or more to get across. The number gives weight to the courage. 300 yards is not a metaphor. It is a sprint measured under a sky that is trying to kill you. The enemy had drilled for this. They were not amateurs. They fell back on order through Dakeshi's smashed houses, rifles slung tight across chests. Sledge watched them trot through ruins, bobbing helmets, no packs, cartridges crossed like belts over a chest. His squad held fire because the 7th Marines were somewhere just out of sight. Then a new sound cut through the anger of men forced to watch. A swishing, rushing sound of shells passing low overhead made us all duck reflexively. Large, black, sausage-shaped clouds. Each of those deadly 155mm bursts exploded with a flash and a kerrump. It is the sentence of the war. The artillerymen were zeroed in on target. The Japanese broke into a dead run that looked like pride even as it carried them toward death. Flame made a different sentence. It silenced the rule every defender had trusted. Wait in the cave, survive the storm. Fire went inside where men kept their courage. It ate oxygen. It drank the breath out of rooms carved by months of labor. When the Navy stopped and the artillery lifted and the mortars paused, the flamethrower spoke, and the cave answered by coughing out men who had to choose between heat and steel. Sledge saw it and did not turn away from the cost. He admitted the pounding gave him a continuous headache that never left. He admitted the barrages imposed a dullness beyond anything he knew, yet he also saw the enemy remained deep in their caves until it stopped and then swarmed up to repulse each attack, which meant American guns and fire had to cave the positions in, not just scare them. We caved them. That is a hard sentence, and an honest one. A prisoner said the quiet part aloud. We waited for quiet. Your fire brought the quiet into the cave. He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. He wasn't weak. He was defeated by a tempo faster than muscle. That was the lesson learned under Wanna's cliffs. Courage cannot outrun a republic that keeps its guns fed. The trucks did not stop. The 5-inch guns kept time from the sea. Mortars coughed in the drawers. Tanks, those 30 iron throats, kept speaking language that rock could not answer. For the Americans, the miracle was not a single machine, it was the orchestra. The Marines moved as if the valley were a lock, and somebody had found the right sequence. A tank pushed, the dozer blade throwing aside stone like snow. A rifleman pointed to a vent hole and a flamethrower traced a bright reply. A radio murmured, and far-away lanyards jerked. When Sledge looked up and wondered what quiet felt like, he was measuring the success. The enemy's schedule was broken. You cannot time your surge when the valley never stops shaking. You cannot plan a counterattack when your map has fallen into the stream and your command post is a bruise in the rock. Even in this work, the American character showed. The tanks did not run over wounded who reached for help. Corpsmen moved with the same courage as gunners. Men who had been taught to hate still did their jobs without cruelty. Sledge recorded rage for the mutilations he saw and still refused to desecrate a corpse. That is the edge. A free country tries to keep even when throwing fire into darkness. Brutality breaks things. Discipline wins wars and lets you look your children in the eye afterward. The valley did not forget what we did there. Neither did we, and the difference matters. By evening, the draw still stank of burned fuel and limestone dust. The men drank tepid water and counted magazines. The tanks idled, engines popping, while their crews checked hoses and pressure. Somewhere on the slope, a lone rifle cracked a late shot, a last habit, and was swallowed by far thunder as ships resumed their slow, careful work. The bridge forward was built of steel and fire and human steps. One cave at a time, one sprint at a time, one tank length at a time. The enemy had believed the caves meant forever. The Americans proved forever could end today. A truck with a canvas top groaned up a muddy Okinawa road at midnight, and nobody cheered because that sound had to become normal or men would doubt. The driver leaned forward, wet cigarette stuck to his lip, and counted potholes like old friends. In the back, crates clinked fuses by the crate, powder by the bag, shells by the thousand. The convoy didn't matter to a poster, it mattered to a foxhole. When the sun came up over Wanna Ridge, batteries that had fired through the night did not cough for lack of breath. They inhaled, deeply, and the valley knew it. The thunderous American barrages went on and on for hours and then days. That is not poetry, that is logistics. E.B. Sledge. With the old bray. Sledge's words land like hammer strokes because he lived inside the machine. He felt the headache that I'll never forget. He felt stupefaction spread through a battalion like fog. He watched Marines shrug, breathe, and climb because the barrage had bought an opening. American fire did not announce an attack and stop. It announced, pressed, starved, and returned. It learned the valley's angles and kept reteaching them to the stone. The rumour in the lines, true in the bones, was that our supply line could not be starved. It had too many mouths and too many hands. The Republic believed in more shells, more trucks, more bridge planks, more everything that keeps faith from breaking. The infantry could feel resupply without seeing it. If the FO whispered a grid at 0300 and steel arrived in strings, someone had driven in the dark. If tanks lit flame at dawn and kept spraying, someone had refilled tanks at midnight. If mortars coughed through rain without running dry, someone had counted cases by lantern light. And if the ships answered a shore call in weather that would make a farmer curse, someone had checked bearings twice and believed the next round mattered. How did the Japanese stand up under it? They simply remained deep in their caves until it stopped, and then swarmed up to repulse each attack. So America learned to make stop a word the enemy would not hear. The answer was shells without end. A Japanese prisoner put it in a sentence that sounded like a prayer and a surrender. We waited for the last round, but there was no last round. He was not weak. He was honest. He had measured other armies and found a limit. He had measured this one and found repeated thunder. When he told an interpreter that the night never returned, he meant that illumination rounds made day out of darkness and that a barrage could come at any hour. He meant that runners could not outrun radios. He meant that deep positions felt shallow once the shells began to collapse entrances and cut off air. The miracle was not a single shell. It was a schedule so full of steel that the word tomorrow lost its meaning. Sledge drew the map with plain language. Beyond Awacha and Dakeshi, between the Marines and Shuri, the Wana system waited like a fist, ridge, draw, river, ridge again, all feeding into the Shuri heights. The boundary between 3 amphibious corps and 24 corps ran through the middle of that fortress. On 15 May 1945, the 5th Marines sent 2/5 forward with 3 divided by 5 inches close support. 1/5 came behind as reserve. That is organization, that is supply lines, expressed as formations. Units that know where to go and when to eat have the fuel to keep asking the impossible of teenagers with rifles. You can see logistics with your ears. It sounds like fire for effect at noon, and again at 4, and again at dark, and again at 2 in the morning. It sounds like a battery chief telling a man to swap a hot tube before sunrise. It sounds like a sergeant counting fuses with greasy fingers, then snapping a box shut and stomping mud off his boots. It sounds like a ship's chief yelling over wind to keep the feed steady because the shore call is coming in hot. The valley does not care about speeches. It cares about whether the next round lands when a corporal needs it. This is where American kindness and American iron meet. The same nation that sent Bob Hope to tell jokes to kids in muddy dungarees also sent enough 5-inch shells to make a whole mountain answer to a corporal's request. The same country that trained corpsmen to risk everything for one wounded boy also trained fire direction centers to break a ridge with arithmetic. That combination is the heritage to be proud of. Generosity in the same breath as precision. We didn't run out of shells. We didn't run out of heart. The enemy's shock grew day by day. A cave that had survived one bombardment failed the third. A command phone that worked last night snapped to silence this morning. A counterattack that had a chance at dawn died in pre-registered kill zones by afternoon. We stood in silence and watched as the artillery fire took its toll. The silence in that line is the measure of respect. Marines did not cheer. They understood that endurance wears down into dust. They also understood that every ton of steel saved some American mother the worst telegram in the world. Sledge wrote about wondering what a quiet place felt like. He was not complaining. He was bearing witness to the new physics of war America had built. When your factories can feed fleets and armies at once, you can turn a fortress into a schedule. You can make an enemy commander plan around horizons of hurt, not hours of pause. You can turn "hold until the barrage lifts" into a sentence that never ends. The trucks rattled back down the hill at dawn, empty and fearless. Another convoy rolled up behind them, full and impatient. The guns were cleaned, the breeches greased, and the first call of the morning landed while men were still shaking rain out of their sleeves. There is a special pride in that kind of power. It is quiet and stubborn. It looks like a driver wiping his hands and nodding to a gun crew as they crack open another crate. It looks like a corporal who slept 40 minutes and still smiles because he heard the batteries firing all night and knows they'll keep firing until he's past the next wall. It looks like a republic that believes in the boring miracle of more and turns it into the beautiful miracle of lives saved. Shells without end isn't a boast. It's a promise kept in the mud. A forward observer pressed his face into wet grass and drew a square on a map with a pencil that kept tearing the paper. He gave a grid. He listened. Overhead, the long swish came like wings. The first rounds fell long and punched dust out of the far slope. He corrected. The smoke walked back toward the cave scars. The next string burst over the right place, black clouds that looked like sausage, flashes with a hard carump. The air itself became a weapon. The observer did not grin. He kept counting. He had learned that the nation behind him had taught every battery to speak the same language. The artillerymen were zeroed in on target. That sentence is both miracle and method. Setup question. How do you turn chaos into certainty when the ground is broken, radios are wet, and men are scared? The American answer was standardization, so tight it looked like instinct. Calls for fire had a grammar. Gunnery tables gave the same answers in rain and shine. Fire direction centers could mass separate batteries in minutes, adjust by known brackets, and lift on time so riflemen could live behind the wall of steel. When Sledge watched those bursts stitch the air, he was seeing a nation's love of rules become mercy for boys on the line. When he ran 300 yards through Wanna Draw, he trusted that the lift would be exactly where the book said it would be, and exactly when the FO said it would. The valley itself told you when the math worked. If the Japanese broke into a trot and then into a dead run, the corrections were hunting them. Sledge saw their discipline, even their pride. They didn't move like men in panic. We knew they simply had been ordered to fall back to other strongly prepared defensive positions to prolong the campaign. That admission gives weight to the accuracy that cut them down. Courage alone won't beat arithmetic, fired at speed. The FO's calm voice could move a curtain of fragments 50 yards left and then 25 short, while another battery, miles away, took the same order and dropped in on the exact line. You cannot outrun that. The Marines learned to listen to the geometry. Outgoing swish meant safety. Impact meant count to 5 and then move. When the wall of noise stepped forward, the platoon stood and went with it. The trick inside the trick was restraint. To be this lethal, you have to be careful. The same kid who could bend fire to a map would hold his trigger because a friendly unit was somewhere out of sight to the right and left. We couldn't risk firing for fear of hitting those Marines. The math was not just about killing. It was about not killing the wrong people. That is American excellence at its best, competence tied to conscience. Behind the clean corrections was human cost. Sledge wrote about the continuous headache. He wrote about hours that stretched into days. He wrote about a sense of dullness that made thought thick. Accuracy does not make war gentle. It makes it winnable. It makes a path you can actually take. When he asked, "How did the Japanese stand up under it?" the answer came with the same precision as a fuse setting. They hid deep, then swarmed to the lip as the barrage lifted, which meant American fire had to cave the caves, not just frighten them. That is math hauling stone. It is patience made of steel. The map of Wana teaches why this mattered. Beyond Awacha and Dakeshi, Wana Ridge stood like a knife. On the far side, Wanna Draw ran down to the Asato Gawa. Above it, the heights marched to Shuri. The line between 3 amphibious corps and 24 corps split the enemy's main defense like a seam. On 15 May 1945, the 5th Marines sent 2/5 forward with 3/5 close behind and 1 divided by 5 inches reserve. In that posture, you do not want chaos. You want predictability, so fierce it feels like fate. The FO's numbers turned terrain into a plan, and the plan into a road. A POW explained the other side of this. Our runners were brave. Your shells were faster. He meant radios beat legs. He meant a correction could find a moving squad in the time it takes to tie a bootlace. He meant deep positions could survive noise, but not the precise lift and shift that placed fragments in the exact place men must pass through to counterattack. He meant the night, once a friend, became a lit grid under star shells and pre-sighted lines. When your enemy can talk in numbers that govern steel, distance becomes a rumor. The map in his hands shrank until every mark on it meant danger. Americans do not brag well about math, but we should. Every saved step is a saved life. Every clean lift means a father who goes home. Every standard call means 2 units that have never met can work like they trained together for years. Sledge's company could feel that even when he didn't use the terms. He watched a valley that couldn't have provided a better opportunity for their defense if they had designed it, to begin to answer, to a corporal's pencil. You cannot build pride nobler than that. A free people teaching their sons to speak a language that turns cliffs into coordinates and fear into discipline. At dusk, the observer's pencil was down to a nub. The paper was soft from rain. He gave one last correction, heard one last swish, and felt the burst on his cheeks like warm breath. The lift came on time. A breath later the platoon rose, and Wanna Draw gave them 20 yards it would never return. The FO didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The nation behind him had already told him what the math would do when he used the right words. That is the secret the enemy never knew at first. Not just that our guns were loud, but that they were obedient. In a war full of chaos, Obedience to numbers made miracles in minutes, and minutes made victory. A Marine lay in a slit trench at 0200 and blinked because the sky wouldn't go dark. Star shells floated like pale moons, and the ground kept thumping as if a giant walked the ridges in slow boots. The kid knew what it meant. Night was supposed to belong to the infiltrator, the knife team, the desperate dash across a gully. Not here, not tonight. American gunners had turned darkness into a stage lit on command, and every path the enemy tried to use flashed into view, then vanished under timed bursts. Even the men in caves felt it, a strange pressure in the lungs when blasts thumped and dust rolled back into mouths. They waited for the quiet that meant they could surge. The quiet didn't come. The orchestra kept time. The Marines had learned this rhythm by pain and repetition. The day's fire would crash across Wanna Ridge and pour down into Wanna Draw. Then the night would hum with steady work, harassing fires, interdiction, illumination, the deliberate cutting of every thread the enemy tried to re-tie before dawn. The thunderous American barrages went on and on for hours, and then days. Eugene Sledge wrote, and he wasn't writing metaphors. He was writing about noise that lived in the bones and made thought feel heavy. When he asked how the Japanese endured it, the answer was brutal and clear. They hid deep, waited for the storms to pass, then swarmed up to repulse each attack, so American guns and air had to cave the positions, not just scare them. That was the new rule of the island. E.B. Sledge, with the old brie. A corpsman crawled along the trench line and touched shoulders, counting. He had seen Doc Caswell's blood on a foxhole lip earlier, and felt his throat close. He had watched gunners keep firing while medics pulled friends out by the straps. Sledge remembered bending over Caswell as other corpsmen worked the neck wound, then looking up, because the barrage on Wanna Draw never paused, and the work of the morning would demand every hand that could still close on a web strap. Our massive artillery, mortar, naval gunfire, and aerial bombardment continued. A total of 30 tanks, including 4 flamethrowers, blasted and burned Wanna Draw. The thunderous American barrages went on and on. That sentence is the heartbeat of the night. No grand speeches, just power delivered on time so frightened boys could keep moving at dawn. The enemy was skilled and brave. They were not surprised by noise. They had built their war around outlasting it. But the night that should have been their ally became a measured thing. Runners could not outrun a radio. A squad that shifted positions could be heard, plotted, and punished before it reached a new cave. When the sky whitened over the ridge and the swish of outgoing shells crossed the lines again, Japanese soldiers felt the maddening truth. The Americans didn't tire, and their guns behaved like one giant, obedient machine. We stood in silence and watched as the artillery fire took its toll. Sledge recalled of a different moment, but the tone fits the night too. The quiet awe of men watching a system do what no one thought possible for so long. Logistics made the miracle. Trucks clawed up mud roads at midnight with fuses and powder and 155mm shells. Ammunition came by the crate, heavy, hateful, necessary, carried by hand across slick draws because vehicles bogged down. The book doesn't romanticize that grind. Sledge cursed the shape of wooden rifle ammo cases and praised the rope handles on grenade boxes, then described moving tons by human back, through knee-deep mud for hours on end. That is how a nation keeps stars in the sky all night, by teaching teenagers to lift together again and again until the fire plan becomes a promise. There were moments of grace in the glare. A Marine shared a canteen with an Okinawan mother herded through a gap in the line, the water tasting like tin and mercy. A tank crewman kicked loose rubble from a cave mouth and paused because he heard coughing inside that didn't sound like soldiers. The Americans were not soft. They were exact. They believed in hitting the right thing at the right time and in taking care of the wounded, enemy or friend, when the smoke cleared. That kind of control was a weapon too, because it steadied hands and calmed minds. Men who believe their own side won't waste them fight longer and straighter. The night also carried memory. Sledge wrote that on 8 May 1000, 945, when Nazi Germany surrendered, the front on Okinawa barely looked up. "So what?" someone muttered. Then the line shook as a terrific American artillery and naval barrage rolled downrange, fired not just to smash Japanese positions, but as a noon salute to VE Day. Mud, rain, hunger, and still the gunners kept perfect time. That barrage did more for Marine morale than the European news because it said something personal. "We have you, and we will keep you, through the night and into the morning." The enemy's shock grew in small, cruel increments. Entrances collapsed, vents clogged with dust. Phone wires snapped and would not get spliced, because the path to the junction box was now a killing lane. A junior officer who had planned to lead a squad out at 0300 to hit the Marine flank watched the ground turn white with light and then black with bursts. He put the plan away and counted survivors. He had run the math wrong. America had found a way to make minutes into weapons. At dawn, a Marine rubbed grit from his eyes, heard the lift called, and stood with the rest. The line stepped into smoke that smelled like limestone and fuel. Tanks moved forward, and somewhere far behind, a director officer on a destroyer adjusted a knob to keep the beats even. The corporal knew none of those details. He knew what the night had done for him. It had kept the enemy at arm's length and given his unit the chance to advance one more fold in the ridge. That is the gift a country can give its sons when it makes science and discipline into shields. The last star shell drifted down, a thin hiss in wet air. The Marines tightened chin straps and moved out, the ground gritty under soles, the world weirdly quiet now that the guns had stepped forward. A boy from Alabama looked at the ridge and felt fear and pride in the same breath. He was part of something that could rewrite the dark. He would carry that truth the rest of his life. "Haul ass and don't stop for anything till you get across." The NCO barked, and 4 men slid down an embankment into one draw. Sledge carried a Thompson across his chest. The Japanese machine guns rattled from the left. The tracers looked like long white ropes stretched across the air. He didn't zig or zag, because he knew the artillery was lifting exactly 100 yards ahead, and then a little more. He ran straight. He heard bullets zip and snap around his head. He hit a trickle of water in the draw floor, splashed once, and sprinted up the far slope toward a spur of ridge. "We must have run about 300 yards or more to get across," he wrote. And anyone who has run 300 yards in peace can feel the weight of doing it under fire. The run was possible because the barrage moved like a wall. "Our artillery was swishing overhead," Sledge wrote, and that sound became permission. To the left and right, Marine machine guns stitched lanes, and on the far horizon the ships kept station. It was not one miracle, it was many. A forward observer had cut the lift. A fire direction center had massed batteries. Gunners had set fuses for airburst so fragments would whip over trenches. Tank crews waited to shove forward the instant the first files reached cover. If even one piece hesitated, 4 men in the open would pay the price. They didn't. The orchestra hit its cue. The enemy was not incompetent. Their riflemen were disciplined. They didn't move like men in panic, Sledge said of another moment, watching a Japanese unit jog through ruins with arrogant posture, even as 155mm air bursts started popping above them. That is the right way to respect a foe. Tell the truth about his courage, then tell the truth about what beat it. Large, black, sausage-shaped clouds erupted as timed bursts. The artillerymen were zeroed in on target. The survivors faded into smoke as Marine machine guns rattled. That combination, the clean lift, the timed bursts, the interlocking fires made 300 yards under tracers survivable. It turned no man's land into a sprintable path. The human cost never left the frame. Just before that sprint, Sledge had seen Doc Caswell wounded. He opened his lips to speak, and blood trickled out. Hearts don't harden in moments like that. They narrow. The only answer was to run when told, and make the barrage count. Minutes after leaving Caswell to other corpsmen, Sledge was moving again because the valley doesn't wait for grief. Our massive artillery, mortar, naval gunfire and aerial bombardment continued, he wrote, and the pounding that hurt heads also kept boys alive. That is a cruel equation, but it is honest. When the four reached the far spur, their legs burned. They hugged limestone that smelled like broken shells and rain. The platoon followed in waves, each wave timed to the moving wall. Someone in the rear shouted, and the word passed like current. Across! A replacement tripped and face, planted in the stream. A veteran yanked him up with one hand and pushed him hard enough to send him stumbling toward cover. In that shove was the whole war. A nation of strangers welded by training and trust, moving as one because the map said now was the only second that mattered. Sledge's picture of the place, ridge, draw, river, ridge again, explains why the sprint mattered. Warner aimed like an arrow into the Shuri fortresses. The terrain gave the defender every possible advantage. On 15 May 1945, 2/5 led with 3 divided by 5 inches close support and 1 divided by 5 inches reserve. The seam between 3 amphibious corps and 24 corps ran through this knot of stone. In ground like that, 300 yards is the difference between a platoon living or being cut to pieces. It is the difference between the valley remaining a Japanese hallway and becoming an American doorway. When they pushed again, the Marines felt the artillery step with them. The FO's pencil scratched on a damp map. The batteries breathed. We stood in silence and watched as the artillery fire took its toll. Sledge said earlier, silence again, no whooping, no triumph, because men who have sprinted under tracers know what paid for the next 10 yards. They count magazines, they check each other's helmets for new chips, they listen for the next lift, they do not waste the gift. A prisoner looked at the ground they had crossed and shook his head. He said they had waited for the barrage to stop, as doctrine and honor demanded. He said they rose and found the sky still dangerous because the air itself burst. He said, almost gently, that Americans had taught the island to obey a whistle. He wasn't insulting himself, he was measuring. Every army asked men to run. Only one made the run survivable by math and steel in this way, at this speed for this long. By dusk, the draw held a new line scratched into it by teenagers. 300 yards behind, a corpsman finished a bandage on a man who didn't make the second sprint. 300 yards ahead, a tank engine coughed, and a driver wiped rain off a dashboard with a sleeve. Somewhere far offshore, a destroyer fired again because a spotter asked and there were still shells to give. The line held. The wall moved. The sprint that should have been suicide became a road to the next day. Rain hammered helmets. Mud filled boot prints so fast men looked like they were walking on pudding. The smell was limestone and fuel, and the faint copper tang of fear. Then the first swish sounded overhead, and the world reset to the only clock that mattered. The American barrage. Sledge's words are plain and heavy. The thunderous American barrages went on and on for hours and then days. I had a continuous headache I'll never forget. Those thunderous, prolonged barrages imposed on me a sense of stupefaction and dullness far beyond anything I ever had experienced before. He wasn't complaining. He was measuring what it took to break a fortress line that should have held for months. The pattern at Wana was not a single thunderclap. It was a climate. Tanks burned caves. Mortars stitched edges. Ships pushed salvos inland when the weather turned cruel. Planes bit ridgetops when clouds lifted. Then all of it happened again. Our artillery, heavy mortars, ships' guns and planes, then plastered the enemy positions all over again. Sledge wrote, until the noise and shock made me wonder what it was like to be in a quiet place. The Japanese answered with their own guns, professional and deadly. But the arithmetic of endurance had shifted. Runners can't outrun radios. Caves can't keep air when entrances collapse. Strong points can't lead counterattacks when their maps are holes. The men carried this storm on their backs. Ammunition was piled about 50 yards away. Working parties went off to carry the supplies. Through knee-deep mud for hours on end. Sledge remembered. Grenade boxes with rope handles earned blessings. Rifle ammo cases earned curses. It is good to say this aloud. American firepower does not fall from the sky. It is lifted by hand at night by kids who are already too tired to speak. That is also part of the superiority the enemy felt, but could not see the will to keep the ugly, boring miracles happening so the beautiful ones explode on cue. Even victory in Europe couldn't slow the island's heartbeat. On 8 May 1945, news of VE Day drifted along the line and sank without a splash. "So what?" someone said. Then a terrific, thundering artillery and naval gunfire barrage rolled toward the Japanese. It hit real targets at noon and saluted the day at the same time. The men felt seen. The Republic was not throwing a parade far away. It was putting steel where they needed it, when they needed it. That barrage did more for morale than headlines because it meant more sprints could happen. More foxholes would survive the next hour. More boys would write letters home. The enemy's reaction shows you the truth. They simply remained deep in their caves until it stopped, and then swarmed up to repulse each attack. Sledge wrote of their discipline. "So our heavy guns and airstrikes had to knock down, cave in, or otherwise destroy those positions. Hours became days because that is how you defeat an army that refuses to panic. You don't rely on them to break. You break the ground they stand in. You make Earth itself unsafe. You keep hitting until the cave mouth is no longer a doorway but a tomb. It feels merciless. It saves American lives. It ends battles. Leadership mattered in the grind." JSGT. Henry, Hank boys, wounded twice and refusing evacuation, kept K divided by 3 divided by 5 steady when malaria knocked out the company commander. "Stern but compassionate," the note reads. Marines ran 300 yards under tracers because someone like Boys kept his voice even, counted men, and pushed the next squad at the right second. That steadiness is an American advantage too. NCOs growing from dairy farms and shop floors into battlefield anchors, men who make the machine personal. A mortar section leader like Burgin could spot a hidden gun, call a mission, and watch his own rounds knock it out Bronze Star work done in mud because the math and the courage lived in the same man. By the end of May's second week, the map had changed. Awacha and Akeshi fell. The boundary seam held. Wana Ridge loomed and then began to chip. Wana aimed, like an arrow, into Shuri, perfect for defense. But now the arrowhead was dulling. The 6th Marine Division slid in on the right. The 1st Marine Division shifted left. Together they made a center of gravity no fortress could ignore. Men crouched in muddy holes in the cold rain and felt the weight shift from enduring to advancing. The longest ordeal had begun, and it was being won the American way, with precision repeated until it looked like fate. There's always a last image. A Marine wipes water from his eyes and watches a new line of black puffs climb a ridgeline like steps. He stands when the barrage lifts and feels his fear fall behind him like a shadow. He is only one man, but he is backed by an idea that never sleeps. If a free people decide to be exact and relentless, they can make hours become days and days become victory. The guns keep time. The trucks keep coming. The Republic keeps its promise. The ground shook like a drum and a Marine checked his watch because the numbers mattered. He was not timing courage. He was timing the interval between correction and impact. At Wana Draw, you could feel how fast America solved problems. A forward observer gave a grid. Fire direction centers answered. 155mm howitzers barked in teams. 5-inch naval guns added their beat from the sea. Timed fuses turned air into knives. The first minute stunned. The second minute punished. The next 8 erased a position and the belief that anyone could stand in the open and live. The question that haunted the enemy was simple. How can anyone keep this up? The answer was arithmetic written in steel. 30 tanks, including 4 flamethrowers, rolled to the lip of the draw. Mortars coughed from cover. Batteries massed fires as if they were one giant weapon. When the first cut finished, the second began from a new angle. Ships kept station. Planes bit the ridge when clouds lifted. The cycle did not wait for speeches. It waited for grids. Then it worked again. A Marine infantryman felt it with his whole body. He heard the swish of outgoing rounds close enough to rattle his ribs. He watched the bursts rise like black sausages above trench lines. He smelled limestone dust and fuel, copper and cordite. He ran when the wall lifted exactly 100 yards ahead, because the math said that was the safest space on the earth. He did not pray for a miracle. The miracle had already happened. A democracy had taught strangers to act like one mind under fire. The Japanese were professionals. They knew how to wait out a bombardment. They had trained to swarm back to the lip the second the thunder stopped. They were brave. They were exact. But the Americans changed the rule by refusing to stop. If movement was seen, fire returned in seconds. If a cave mouth held, flame found it. If a counterattack formed, the sky turned white with star shells and then black with bursts. Runners could not outrun a radio. Orders could not outrun a correction. The gunners were craftsmen, not slogans. A section chief changed a hot tube before dawn. A fuse setter spun dials with greasy fingers and checked twice. A plotter dragged a pencil across clear acetate. A radio operator cupped his hand against rain and said, "Drop 100, left 50. They were teenagers and foremen, farmers' sons and shipyard welders. They did not ask the infantry to worship them. They asked the infantry to trust them. The infantry did, and lived. A corpsman moved with that same precision. He pressed a bandage into a neck wound and said, "You're all right, buddy," because he had learned that calm words, steady hands. Behind him, 155 seconds walked the ridge. Above him, a destroyer's 5-inch punched deep. A tank dozer blade cut a new path, throwing aside rock like snow. The corpsman looked up once, caught a breath, and crawled again. Arithmetic does not feel cold when it is buying one more minute for a bleeding boy. The map of the place is a teacher. Wana Ridge is the north wall. Wana Draw is the throat. The Asato Gawa is the drain. Shuri rises behind it all like a stone anvil. The boundary between 3 amphibious corps and 24 corps splits the fortress. On 15 May 1945, the 5th Marines pushed with 2/5 up, 3/5 close, 1 divided by 5 inches reserve. Every move depended on timing. Every timing depended on guns. That is why a watch mattered more than a speech. There is a number hiding in plain sight. On peak days, the 10th Army hurled thousands of artillery rounds at this one complex of ridges and caves. Each round had a number, a charge, a fuse, a predicted point of burst. Each one required hands, fuel, and a will that did not crack in rain. The Japanese counted too. They counted minutes until quiet. They counted runners who did not return. They counted caves that no longer answered. In that counting lay the verdict. A prisoner gave a simple report. "We waited for the last round," he said softly. But there was no last round. He was not asking for pity. He was explaining a new kind of defeat. The cave was supposed to be time armor. America broke the clock. The barrages did not announce an attack. They carried the attack. The lift did not mean rest. It meant the infantry was already running behind a moving wall. The defender's calendar lost its pages in a single day. The Marines did not cheer when a ridgeline went silent. They stood in silence and watched as the artillery took its toll. Then they tightened chin straps and crossed open ground that still stank of fuel. They respected their enemy. They respected their own. They knew the cost of every minute, because they had felt the minutes hammer their skulls and shake their ribs. They also knew what the arithmetic was buying: a road to Shuri, and to the end. The day the line advanced 2 gullies, the ground crew in a battery cheered a different victory. A sergeant had spent an hour in mud chains to pull one truck through a bad turn. Men laughed once, quick and tired, then went back to work. The last truck made it up the road with fuses and powder before midnight. The section chief clapped the driver on the shoulder and said, "Good work." No band played, no flag waved. But that delivery meant the first volley at dawn would be on time. It meant a corporal could trust the next lift. That is how arithmetic becomes mercy. At last light, a Marine checked his watch again. 10 minutes had rewritten a hillside. 10 hours had rewritten a valley. 10 days would rewrite an island. He did not say any of that. He wiped grit from his eyes and moved when the wall lifted. The numbers were still working. The island was still listening. The enemy, for the first time, believed it might never hear quiet again. A rain squall slid over the ridges, and the first thing the Marines noticed was that the gun line did not care. 5-inch salvos still came in from the ships. 155 seconds still walked the slope. Mortars still coughed like old men in the dark. The valley had learned America's secret. Weather could slow planes, but it could not slow a doctrine that used every arm like a gear. Strongpoints with proud names began to lose them. The unbreakable started, breaking. Shuri was supposed to be a wall of forever. It was caves within caves, switchbacks, vents, murder holes, and interlocking fire. The enemy had done everything right. They aimed Wana like an arrow at the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions. They stacked the heights behind the Asato Gawa and dared the 10th Army to pay in blood. America paid, and made the bill run in reverse. Every costly yard bought 3 back. The recipe was steady and cruel. Tanks with dozers and flamethrowers went first. Engineers cut lanes through rubble and mines. Forward observers called massed fires, then shifted them like a door. Infantry advanced with M1 Garands, bars on the flanks, Thompsons tucked under elbows. When the enemy rose to meet them, star shells made noon at midnight, and the next cut fell. If a cave mouth choked the lane, a jet of fire drank its air. If an exit opened behind, naval guns smashed the rear slope. Every habit the defender trusted became a risk. Sledge felt the turn. He had written about stupefaction from barrages that stretched for days, about a headache that never left. He had run 300 yards under tracers because the wall moved in front of his boots. Now he watched positions that had repelled earlier assaults fail on schedule. He saw stone hillsides become brittle. He saw Japanese riflemen counterattack into pre-registered kill zones. He saw his company take ground and keep it. He watched teenagers shoulder packs and press because the machine behind them promised not to quit. Inside the caves, officers made good plans that died in the air. Runners were fast, corrections were faster. Phone wires lay in muddy gullies. Fragments cut them again and again, always. A lieutenant told his men to stand by for a push at 1,500, then listened to a new barrage fold over his own voice. The men were not cowards. They had seen other invaders break. But this was not noise that burned itself out. It was a schedule, and schedules crush courage by refusing to give it a clean moment to bloom. The Americans were not machines. They were neighbors with rifles. They kept promises. A gun crew passed canteens to an Okinawan family coming through the lines. A tank commander held fire because a child ran from a doorway. A corpsman risked his life for a man he had met yesterday. That isn't softness. It is control deadly and decent in the same breath. A prisoner said, "You fight hard. You do not waste." Numbers still spoke loudest. 2 Marine divisions absorbed casualties that would have broken smaller armies and kept their shape. The fleet took brutal blows and still kept station. The 10th Army consumed mountains of ammunition and never told a battalion, "We're out." Japanese military dead climbed toward a number no officer could explain away. American dead climbed into the tens of thousands. Those are terrible facts. They also say this: the side that kept the arithmetic going would finish the fight. JSGT, Henry Hank boys, became a symbol of that endurance. Wounded twice, malaria racking his body, he stayed with K divided by 3 divided by 5 and held boys together with a voice that did not shake. A mortar section leader named Burgin knocked out a hidden gun with his own rounds and earned a bronze star. An FO with a pencil and a map spoke a language that moved steel in seconds. None of them called themselves heroes. They were Americans doing a job they believed mattered more than their fear. The enemy learned new griefs. Entrances they had carved by hand collapsed. Vents that had carried air for months filled with dust. Command posts could not hear each other. When officers gathered to plan, The meeting place drew fire within minutes because someone had seen it and someone had a radio and someone else had guns that answered instantly. They had built a maze. The Americans did not solve it. They smashed enough walls for the maze to become rubble. One day, during a lull that was not a real lull, the line heard Europe's war was over. So, what? Someone said, without bitterness. Then a great American barrage rolled downrange. It hit real targets and said something else. The Republic has not forgotten you. Men smiled into rain. Steel can feel like love when it arrives exactly when you need it. The salute was a promise. We will keep firing until this fortress fails. By the end of May's third week, even stubborn doubters could see the change. The Shuri line had not fallen, but it was failing. Patrols found cave mouths caved in and tunnels that breathed warm dust and nothing else. Fields of fire that had once spit bullets went quiet. The map the enemy carried no longer matched the ground. The Americans had broken not just positions, but timing, and without timing a fortress is a pile of rocks. At dusk, a Marine looked across the draw and saw the impossible, open ground that could be crossed in daylight without certain death. He still felt fear. He still missed men who had fallen an hour earlier. He still had mud in his teeth and thunder in his ears. But he was part of a tide now. When the order came, he rose with the others and walked into a space America had made where there had been none for months. The unbreakable was breaking. The wall was turning into a road. A boy wiped mud from his watch crystal and realized he had been measuring a nation's will. 10 minutes to erase a ridgeline. 10 hours to turn a valley. 10 weeks to break a fortress. The numbers sound like bragging until you stand in the draw and feel how they happened. Radios that never slept. Guns that obeyed. Trucks that climbed all night. Ships that kept station in rain. And teenagers who trusted a wall of steel enough to sprint behind it. This is the ledger the enemy didn't believe could exist. Start with the arithmetic of shells. The 10th Army fired thousands of artillery rounds on peak days at Okinawa. Naval guns added their own tonnage for weeks. Aircraft chewed ridgetops whenever weather opened a hole in the clouds. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions bled grievously and still advanced with integrity. The fleet took terrible hits and still answered shore calls at all hours. That is not noise. That is America choosing to be exact and relentless until stone consented. Add the human entries. Eugene's sledge of K divided by 3 divided by 5 watched large, black, sausage-shaped clouds climb hillsides as timed bursts shredded trenches, then ran 300 yards under tracers because the lift landed where the map said it would. He felt a continuous headache from barrages that went on and on for hours and then days, then stood when told because someone behind him kept every violent promise. He saw 30 tanks, including 4 flamethrowers, blast one a draw, then watched artillery, mortars, ships, and planes plaster the positions again. That is how minutes become weapons. Add the culture entries. A democracy trained 19-year-olds to be forward observers who could move mountains with a pencil. It taught gunners to swap hot tubes before dawn and to check fuse settings twice in the dark. It taught sailors in blue dungarees to keep 5-inch guns talking even when the sea tried to throw them off the plot. It taught NCOs like GSGT, boys to hold boys together with stern kindness. It taught corpsmen to crawl forward under fire, because one life mattered right now. Only a country sure of its values makes precision and mercy live in the same trench. Add the enemy's numbers. Japanese units at Shuri counted on time more than anything. Endure the storm, then surge when it stops. They discovered a calendar that did not flip pages. We waited for the last round, but there was no last round, a prisoner said. Not as poetry, but as a report. The Americans turned minutes into weapons and denied the cave its promise of forever. Entrances collapsed. Vents choked. Runners vanished between 2 points on a map that had always felt safe before. The fortress began to empty itself without orders. Add the moral entries. On VE Day, Marines didn't get a parade. They got a barrage that hit real targets and said, "We see you." In the same valley, A tank commander held fire when a child ran from a doorway. A gun crew shared water with civilians who looked like ghosts. Sledge wrote about rage and restraint in the same breath. The nation was not perfect. It was disciplined. It believed that accuracy was a duty, and that mercy, where possible, was strength. The enemy noticed. You fight hard, you do not waste. Now turn the ledger and stare at the totals. Japanese military dead would exceed 100,000 on the island. American dead would exceed 12,000, with total US casualties near 50,000, and still the machine advanced with precision every day. Those are brutal facts. They are also proof that no other nation in 1945 could sustain this scale of exact violence and measured mercy for this long while, also feeding fleets and armies across an ocean. The United States did it because free citizens believed standards mattered more than slogans. The last weeks around Shuri did not feel like triumph. They felt like wet boots, sore shoulders, and a clock that never ticked to quiet. But the effects were astonishing. Positions that had smoked through earlier bombardments simply weren't there anymore. Command posts breathed dust and silence. Patrols came back saying, "It's open." A ridge that should have killed a company in an afternoon now let 2 squads cross at noon. The impossible began to feel routine, which is the surest sign that an army has mastered its craft. There was one more entry the men carried home. America's kindness was not a performance, it was a habit. Corpsmen kept treating prisoners. GIs gave food to children in the rain. Sailors hauled exhausted Marines aboard and pressed coffee into shaking hands. The power that erased a position in 10 minutes also built hospitals and set up field kitchens. That contrast is as American as the M1. Garand carried muzzle down through mud. Lethal, reliable, and held by a citizen who still bowed his head when a chaplain prayed over the fallen. So what do these numbers mean now? They mean our heritage is not just the thunder. It is the orchestra behind it. The planners, the drivers, the riggers, the welders, the kids with handsets, the NCOs who said move at the right breath, the sailors who kept station, the pilots who dove through a hole in the clouds. It is the idea that free people can become terrifyingly competent when they have to be, and gentle again when the job is done. It is a promise kept in mud. At last, the fortress came apart. The Shuri line fractured. The enemy who had believed caves could outlast anything surrendered the high ground or died where he stood. The Marines, filthy and hollow-eyed, stood on slopes that had been impossible in April and looked toward the sea, where ships still waited like patient giants. A boy checked his watch out of habit. 10 minutes for a ridge, 10 hours for a valley, 10 weeks for a fortress. The ledger closed, and America, louder than thunder, steadier than stone, handed the island back to quiet.